evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you here on the Royal House of Ra YouTube channel. Tonight's show is going to be about pre-dynastic Kemet. So we're going to talk about Kemet before the dynastic periods, which that's a discussion that a lot of people don't discuss about. Either they discuss about the dynastic period or they'll discuss about the early Kemetic writings, which is the Metaneta, or they'll discuss about the different spiritual beliefs of Kemet and different gods that represents Kemet's spirituality. But I want to talk about the pre-dynastic period. I have a great article that is by a it's called Pre-Dynastic Period in Egypt by the World History Encyclopedia. This was written by Joshua J. Mark. Okay, and so we're going to get into that. What I would like to say to those that I have, let me just say this because I want to apologize for, because this particular episode 5, which is talking about pre-dynastic Kemet, I had pushed it back a couple times. I changed dates a couple times because I'll be honest with you, I was preoccupied with doing research on this and also doing some other researches that I was interested in. Because I'm going to really start to get into comitology. I'm going to commit myself to it. I'm going to do research. Hopefully, as I do the research and do my own paperwork, I'm also going to conduct an expedition into Kemet and do some study on that particular area. So I think, not I think, but those of us who's in the Kemetic community, we need to support those who are out there in the field doing the research because they are doing the research to link the links between Kemet and the rest of Africa. So that's something that I'm strongly for. Um, as I mentioned, I'm your host, Amin Hotep Kufu Elra, and we're going to get into the show. Now, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to read the article to you. We are going to go into some intermission periods where you can take breaks and do whatever you have to do during that time. I'm also going to play a video after I read the article, and then go into discussing very little about um, episode 6, which we will go into the dynastic period, where we'll talk about. I will go. I will talk about Dynasty Zero, which is um, you have two pharaohs from Dynasty Zero, the Scorpion King and Nama. Okay, so we're going to go into that. We're going to discuss that. That's going to be episode 6, and that would air this Sunday coming January 31st at 7 p.m. Central Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and 5 p.m. Pacific time. Okay, and also I would like for all of you thank you for supporting this show here on YouTube and continue your support. Please like the show, share the show content, and also um, hit the subscribe button and also hit the notification button so you know when new shows will appear. Okay, now let's get into the show here. I'm going to read the article to you about pre-dynastic Kemet. All right, excuse me. Let's get into this now. The pre-dynastic period in ancient Egypt is the time before recorded history from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic age and on to the rise of the first dynasty, and is generally recognized as spanning the era from 6000 to 3150 BCE, though physical evidence argues for a longer history. While there are no written records from this period, archaeological excavations throughout Egypt have uncovered artifacts which tell their own story of the development of culture in the Nile River Valley. The periods of the pre-dynastic period are named for the region's ancient city sites in which these artifacts were found and do not reflect the names of the cultures who actually lived in those areas. The pre-dynastic period was given its name in the early days of archaeological expeditions in Egypt before many of the most important finds were discovered and cataloged, which has led some scholars to argue over when precisely the pre-dynastic period begins and, more importantly, ends. These scholars suggest the adoption of another destination, proto-dynastic period, for that span of time closer to the early dynastic period, 3150 to 2613 BCE, or Zero Dynasty. These destinations are not universally agreed upon, and pre-dynastic period is the term most commonly accepted for the period prior to the first historical dynasties. Methophil's history. In charting the history of ancient Egypt, I'm going to say Kemet because I don't like to say Egypt. So I'm going to it's stated Egypt, but I'm going to say Kemet. Scholars rely on archaeological evidence and ancient works such as the Kemetan's dynastic chronological of Metanetho, a scribe who wrote the Ethiopical, the history of Kemet in the 3rd century BCE. The scholar Douglas J. Brewer describes the work Methodoth history was in its essence a chronological of events arranged from oldest to most recent according to the reign of a particular king. Brewer continues on to describe the events which inspired Methodos to write his history. The origins of the dynastic chronological system dates back to the time of Alexander the Great. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals, one of whom, Ptolemy, received the richest prize, Kemet, under his son Ptolemy II. Philadelphus, 280 BC, and Kemetan priest named Menethil wrote a condensed history of his native land for the new Greek rulers. Menethil, a native of Sebenos in the Delta, had been educated in the old scribal traditions, although Kemet's priests were famous for handing out tidbits of information, often intentionally incorrect, to curious travelers. None had ever attempted to compile a complete history of Kemet, especially for foreigners. Unfortunately, Menethel's original manuscript has been lost, and the only record of his chronology is from the works of later historians such as Flavius Josephus, 37 to 100 CE. This has led to some controversy over how accurate Manetho's chronological is. Even so, it is routinely consulted by scholars, archaeologists, and historians in charting the history of ancient Kemet. The following discussions of the pre-dynastic period relies on archaeological finds over the past 200 years and their interpretation by archaeologists and scholars, but it should be noted the historical sequence did not seamlessly follow each other like chapters in a book, as the dates given for these cultures suggest cultures overlapped, and according to some interpretations, different cultures in the pre-dynastic period can be seen as simply developments of a single culture. Early habitations. The earliest evidence of human habitation in the region is thought by some to go back as far as 700,000 years. The oldest evidence of structures discovered thus far were found in the region of Wadi Haifa, ancient Nubia, in modern day Sudan. These communities were built by a hunter gatherer society who constructed mobile homes on flat sandstone floors, most likely covered by animal skins or brush, and perhaps held up by wooden stakes. The actual structures vanished centuries ago, of course, but man made depressions in the earth with stone floors remain. These depressions were discovered by the Polish archaeologist Waldemar Chemlaski, 1929 to 2004 CE, in the 1980s CE, and were designated tent rings in that they provided an area to set up a shelter which could easily be taken down and moved, similar to what one would find at a modern campsite. These rings are dated to the late Paleolithic age of approximately the 40th millennium BCE. Hunter-gatherer societies continued in the region throughout the periods now designated as those of the Arcturians and Commercians, during which stone tools were manufactured with greater skill. The culture then flourished 30,000 BCE in the region between Egypt, mm, Kemet, and Nubia, which gave way to the Quadan and Sibylline cultures, 10,000 BCE, and the Hafan culture from around the same time. All of these societies are characterized as hunter gatherers who eventually became more sedentary and settled into more permanent communities centered around agriculture, rural rights. One of the most integrating mysteries of prehistoric Kemet is the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic life, represented by the transformation from hunting and gathering to sedentary farming. We know very little about how and why these change occur. Perhaps nowhere is this cultural transition more accessible than in the Fayum Depression, 58. The Fayum Depression, also known as the Fayum Oasis, is a natural basin southeast of the Giza Plateau, which gave rise to the culture known as Phaeacian, a 9,000 to 6,000 BCE. These people inhabited the area around a large lake and relied on agriculture, hunting, and fishing for their living. Evidence of seasonal migration has been found, but for the most part, the area was continually inhabited. Among the earliest artworks discovered from this period are pieces of phases, which appears to have already been an industry as early as 5500 BCE at Abydos. Excuse me. Development of culture in Lower Kemet. The people of Phenion built reed huts with underground cellars for storage of grains, cattle, sheep, and goats were domesticated, and baskets and pottery making developed. Excuse me. Centralized forms of tribal government began at this period, with tribal chieftains assuming positions of power which may have been passed on to the next generation in a family or tribal unit. Communities grew from small tribes which traveled together to extended groups of different tribes living in one area continuously. The Fenian culture gave rise to the Maramida 5500 to 4000 BCE, so called because of the discovery of artifacts at the site of that name on the western edge of the Nile Delta. According to scholar Margaret Brunson, the reed huts of the Fayum, a period gave way to pole frame huts with windbreaks, and some use subterranean resonance resonance building walls high enough to stand above ground. Small the inhabitations were laid out in rows, possibly part of a circular pattern. Granaries were composed of clay jars or baskets buried up to the neck in the ground. These developments were improved upon by the El Omari culture, 4000 BCE, who built oval huts of greater sophistication with walls of plastered mud. They developed blades, tools, and woven mats for floors and walls and more sophisticated ceramics. The Mahdi and the Tyson cultures developed about the same time as the El Omari, characterized by further developments in architecture and technology. They continued the practice of ceramics without ornamentation, begun in the El Mari period, and made use of grindstones. Their greater advance seems to have been in the era of architecture, as they had large buildings constructed in their community, with underground chambers, stairs, and hearths. Prior to the Matari culture, the deceased were buried in or near people's homes for the most part, but around 4000 BCE, cemeteries became more widely used. Bronson notes that three cemeteries were in use during this sequence as at Wadi Digla, although the remains of some unborn children were found in the settlement. Improvements in storage jars and weaponry is also characteristic of this period. Okay. Cultures of Upper Kemet. All of these cultures grew and flourished in the region known as Lower Kemet, Northern Kemet, closest to the Mediterranean Sea, while civilization in Upper Kemet developed later. The Badrinian culture, 4500 to 4000 BCE, seems to have been an outgrowth of the Tassian, though this is disputed. Scholars who support the link between the two point to similarities in ceramics and other evidence such as tool making, while those who dismiss the claim argue that the Bactrians were much more advanced and developed independently. The people of the Bactrian culture lived in tents which were mobile just like their ancient predecessors, but primarily favored stationary huts. They were farmers who grew wheat, barley, and herbs and supplemented their largely valued food and clothing as well as materials for tents. A large number of grave goods have been found from this period, including weapons and tools such as throwing sticks, knives, arrowheads, and planes. People were buried in cemeteries and the bodies covered with animal hides and laid on mats of reeds. During this period, food, offerings, and personal belongings were buried with the dead, indicating a shift in the belief structure, or at least in burial practices, where now the dead were thought to need material goods in their journey to the afterlife. Ceramic work was greatly improved during the Bactrian culture, and the pottery they produced was thinner and more finely crafted than earlier periods. Following the Bactrian period came the Ameritarian, also known as Nakata I, period of 4000 to 3500 BCE, which created more sophisticated dwellings, which may have had windows and definitely had heat hearths, walls of wattled and domed, and windbreaks outside the main doorway. Ceramics were highly developed, as were other artistic pursuits such as sculpting, the backtop, where ceramics or the Mediterranean culture gave way to red ceramics ornaments with images of people and animals. Sometimes around 3500 BCE, the practice of mummification began, and cave goods continued to be left with the deceased. These advances were furthered by the Gersian culture, 3500 to 3200 BCE, also known as Nakata II, who initiated trade with other regions, which inspired changes in the culture and their art. Brunson comments on this writing. Accelerated trade brought advances in the artistic skills of the people of this era, and Palestinians influenced sprouts and handles. A light colored pottery emerged in Nakata II, composed of clay and calcium carbonate. Originally, the vessels had red patterns, changing to scenes of animals, boats, trees, and herds later on. It is possible that such pottery was mass produced at certain settlements for trading purposes. Copper was evident in weapons and in jewelry, and the people of this sequence used gold, foiled, and silver. Flint blades were sophisticated, and beads and amulets were made out of metals and lapis lazuli. Okay, houses were made of sun-baked brick, and the more expensive featured courtyard, an addition within Kemetan's homes later. Graves became more ornate with wood used in the graves of the more affluent and niche carved in the sides for votive offerings. The city of Abydos, north of Nakata, became an important burial site, and large tombs, one with 12 rooms, were constructed, which grew into a necropolis, a city of the dead. These tombs were originally built using mud bricks, but later during the Third Dynasty were constructed constructed of large, carefully hewed limestone. Eventually, the site would become the burial place for the kings of Kemet. Even at this time, however, evidence suggests that the people from around the country had their dead buried at Abydos and sent grave goods to honor their memory. The cities of Exodus and Hippocrates were already considered old by this time, and those of Thynis, Nakata, and Nakatin were developing quickly. Hieroglyphics, better metaneta script developed at some point between 3400 to 3200 BCE, was used for keeping records, but no complete sentences from this period have been found. The earliest Kemetan's writing discovered thus far comes from Abydos at this time and was found on ceramic, clay seal impressions, and bone and ivory pieces. Evidence of complete sentences does not appear in Kemet until the reign of King Haribin, Harrison in the Second Dynasty, 2890 to 2670 BCE. The period led to that of Nakata III, 3200 to 3150 BCE, which, as noted above, is also sometimes referred to as Zero Dynasty or the pre-dynastic period. Following Nakata III, the early dynastic period and the written history of Kemet begins. Okay, so let's go to a brief intermission here, and then we will continue. So let's take a 5 minute brief intermission. Okay, let's get back to this. All right, excuse me. Nakada 3 and the beginning of history. Nakada 3 period shows significant influence of the culture of Mesopotamia, whose cities were in contact with the region through trade. The method of baking, brick, and building, as well as artifacts such as cylinder seals, symbolism on tomb walls, and designs on ceramics, and possibly even the basic form of ancient Kemetic religion can be traced back to Mesopotamian influence. Trade brought new ideas and values of Kemet along with the goods of the traders, and interesting blend of Nubian, Mesopotamian, and Kemetan cultures was most likely the result. Also, excuse me, although this theory is routinely challenged by scholars of each respective culture. Monumental tombs at Abydos and the city of Acropolis both show signs of Mesopotamian influence. Trade with Canaan resulted in sprouting up in what is now southern Israel, and Canaanite influences can be determined through the ceramics of this period. Communities grew and flourished with trade, and the population of both lower and upper Kemet grew. The small communities of brick homes and buildings grew into larger urban centers, which soon attacked each other, probably over trade goods and water supplies. The three major cities of Upper Kemet at this time was Titus, Thinis, Nakata, and Nukthim. Titus seems to have conquered Nakata and then absorbed Nukthim. These wars were fought by the Scorpion Kings, whose identity rested against most likely Ka and Nummer. According to some scholars, the last three kings of the proto-dynastic period were Scorpion I, Scorpion II, and Ka, also known as Sikkim, which is a title, not a name. Before the king Nummer conquered and unified Lower and Upper Kemet and established the first dynasty, Nummer is now often identified with the king known as Minas from Method's chronological, but this claim is not universally accepted. Minos' name is only found in Method's and the Taran King list chronology, while Nummer has been identified as an actual Kemetan ruler through discovery of the Nummer pilot, a year marker bearing his name and his tomb. Minos is said to have conquered the two lands of Kemet and built the city of Memphis as his capital, while Nummer allegedly united the two lands peacefully. This is a this is a curious conclusion to arrive at, however, since a king definitely identified as Nummer is depicted on the Nummer palette, a 2 foot 64 centimeter inscribed slab as a military leader conquering his enemies and subjugating the land. No consensus has been reached on which of these claims is the more accurate or whether the two kings were actually the same person, but most scholars favor the view that Nummer is the minis of Mythos work. It is also claimed that Numa was the last king of the pre-dynastic period and Minos the first of the early dynastic, and further that Minos was actually Horhaha, Horhawa, listed by Minotho and Minos' successor. Whichever is the case, once the great king Nema or Minos united the two lands of Kemet, he established a central government, and the era known as the early dynastic period was begun, which would initiate a culture lasting the next 3,000 years. So that is it for that part of that article, discussing the pre-dynastic period. There's many great cometologists like Shay Diop and others who go into this a little bit further in their books. As you know, Shay Diop is a well-renowned African archaeologist and mathematician, scientist, and he's written many books um, on the subject of ancient Kemet and had shown evidence of them being of African descent. So, what I'm going to do is go into a clip of video, so you guys can hear from. Hold on for a moment. Let me. Okay, I got it. I hope you can hear it. Hold on, it's loading.
Predynastic period in Egypt.
Oh, it's loading. I don't know what's going on here. What's wrong with this thing? It's fine earlier. Okay, something must be wrong with the video. I don't know what's going on, but before it was working fine, now it's not. It was a good video that went into is a little bit shorter, but it went into what we were discussing here. Um, what's going on? It's not responding. Let's see. Trying to get this thing going. Give me a moment. I'm trying to get this thing going. While I'm doing that, let me just put this on for a moment. What's going on here? I don't know. Something's wrong. All right, this video don't look like it's going to play here. What's wrong with this? So here's what we're going to do. Like I had mentioned before.
Channel The Study of Antiquity and the Middle Ages. Predynastic Period in Egypt. Written by Joshua J. Mark. Narrated by D.W. Draffin. The predynastic period in ancient Egypt is the time before recorded history, from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic age and on, to the rise of the first dynasty, and is generally recognized as spanning the era from circa 6000 to 3150 BCE, though physical evidence argues for a longer history. While there are no written records from this period, archaeological excavations throughout Egypt have uncovered artifacts which tell their own story. The dynastic period are named for the region's ancient city sites in which these artifacts were found, and do not reflect the names of the cultures who actually lived in those areas. The predynastic period was given its name in the early days of archaeological expeditions in Egypt, before many of the most important finds were discovered and catalogued, which has led some scholars to argue over when, precisely, the predynastic period begins and, more importantly, ends. These scholars suggest the adoption of another designation, proto-dynastic period, for that span of time closer to the early dynastic period, circa 3150 to 2613 BCE, or Zero Dynasty. These designations are not universally agreed upon, and predynastic period is the term most commonly accepted for the period prior to the first historical dynasties. Manetho's history. In charting the history of ancient Egypt, scholars rely on archaeological evidence and ancient works such as the Egyptian dynastic chronology of Manetho, a scribe who wrote the Egyptaica, the history of Egypt, in the 3rd century BCE. The scholar Douglas J. Brewer describes the work. Manetho's history was, in essence, a chronology of events arranged from oldest to most recent, according to the reign of a particular king. Brewer continues on to describe the events which inspired Manetho to write his history. The origin of the dynastic chronological system dates back to the time of Alexander the Great. After Alexander's death, his empire was divided among his generals, one of whom, Ptolemy, received the richest prize, Egypt. Under his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, circa 280 BCE, an Egyptian priest named Manetho wrote a condensed history of his native land for the new Greek rulers. Manetho, a native of Sebennytus in the Delta, had been educated in the old scribal traditions. Although Egypt's priests